Welcome to this week's edition of Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby. This week, Governor Daniel Malloy delivered his State of the State address, and we have two leaders from the House to talk about what he talked about and what you'll be talking about in the next few months. The session began this week. Let me introduce our guests to you. They are the Speaker of the House, Brendan Sharkey, Democrat, and House Republican leader Larry Cafero of Norwalk and Hamden. I should mention your community.
That's right.
Well.
That's
Thank
right.
you for joining us.
Thank
Good to be here, Tom.
Yeah.
During this address, the governor touted his achievements in and your achievements in the last few years: deficit reduction, economic development, big focus on education last year, energy, pension fund stabilization, and unfortunately, emergency storm response, which we've had a lot of. Proud of it?
Oh, I think tremendously proud of it. Yes, I think the governor's done a great job of leading our state. I think I think the legislature has been a good partner with the governor. Sometimes we have our disagreements about directions we want to take, and we make those things known. But I think we've accomplished an awful lot. I think the sense in the state generally is that whereas perhaps previously we were a little rudderless in terms of our direction, in terms of our focus on making Connecticut competitive and turning our fiscal ship around, I think folks now are feeling as though we're moving in the right direction. I'd also just add that I think what makes that also happen is when we do things on a bipartisan basis, I think we get even a better product when we do that. So,
you're certainly seeking bipartisanship. We hear that from you quite a bit. Do you agree that these were good steps?
I somewhat agree. First and foremost, I want to say the governor's speech, I consider it came in two parts. First, of course, a focus and comment on Newtown tragedy. And I don't think we could thank the governor enough for his leadership during that tragedy. It was obvious it very much affected him as a human being, and certainly as our governor. I don't know how you could go through that without it being affected, and I thought he made a very beautiful speech with regard to the Newtown tragedy. With regard to his accomplishments, I think that was a mixed bag, with all due respect. The governor would have a listener indicate that we are on very solid ground, that we're in good shape, and unfortunately I'd have to disagree. I will agree with Brendan, however. Some of the accomplishments that were listed were successful, and ironically they were, in my opinion, the only accomplishments that were successful were ones that were done in a bipartisan way. It started with our job session back in October 2011. I think it was a very successful session where we worked together over a period of weeks, actually, staff and leaders from all sides and all chambers. Our education initiative was a bipartisan effort. Our energy initiative was a bipartisan effort. And most recently, about a month ago, our deficit mitigation package was a bipartisan effort. Other than that, however, there were various things. For instance, obviously, the two-year budget that's coming to an end. That was not, unfortunately, a bipartisan effort. We were not invited into the table. We were not consulted on that. And unfortunately, I think the results show. We are facing, as we start this legislative session for the next 2 years, about a $2.5 billion deficit. And I bet you've heard that before. We've been here year after year at the start of sessions, shaking our heads saying, unfortunately, we are facing a fiscal crisis. And Tom, it wasn't supposed to be that way this time because of the massive tax increases and all. The governor had promised us almost if we swallowed that hard medicine, a 5-year path of surpluses, et cetera. Hasn't worked out that way, unfortunately. So I would agree with some of what the governor said, certainly those things that were done in a bipartisan manner, but not everything.
I'm going to take a break, swallow a little hard medicine here. When we come back, let's talk about the medicine that we're going to have to consider, at least, to deal with that $2 billion shortfall. Back in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. All right, we've done our walk down memory lane. Let's look forward now. We had the tax increase. I can't see the state swallowing another one. So what do we have to do now to balance this budget?
Well, I think we have to prioritize. I think taxes are an absolute last resort in the coming budget. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind is that for the last few years, unlike our neighboring states in New York, New Jersey, we didn't balance the state budget off the backs of local government. So whereas in other states there were massive local property tax increases over the course of the last 2 years to help the state balance its budget, we haven't done that in Connecticut. I think that going forward, we've got to take another look at that. We've got to, I'm not sure how long we can hold our towns and cities completely harmless from the realities that we're facing in our budget. I think municipal aid roughly is about 15 or 17% of our overall budget expenses. I think we also have to find ways to help towns and cities create more efficiencies at the local level so that that impact will not be as great. And then beyond that, I think we have to grow the economy, do what we can to try to increase our revenues. I mean, part of the problem has been the last 2 years that revenues have not increased to the extent that they, or kept line with the budget, but at the same time, we've also had a massive increase in expenses on the Medicaid side. So we've got to look at how we're doing our programs on the expenditure side to try to mitigate that deficit, but also do what we can to try to increase the economy so that we can be generating the revenues that we were expecting.
Mention of local communities having to step up, take on a larger burden of the costs if the state can't do it, which boils down to another tax increase for people. May not be going to the state, but it's going to be going to the local communities in terms of property tax.
Well, it could be that way, but we keep in mind, Tom, that the exercise that, as Brendan properly pointed out, that we must go through prioritization. Each town and city must do the same thing. One of the worst things that happens in government is if you just get the same amount with a cost of living increase that you got the year before, sometimes it doesn't incent you to change the way you do business. It's more of the same, business as usual. If you had 15 programs, we're going to keep 15 programs. What this financial crisis is forcing us all to do is look at what we do deliver in the way of services, to understand whether or not we could deliver them better, more efficiently, et cetera. And maybe there are some programs out there that just aren't working. And I think we have to be big enough to say, if it's not working, let's get rid of it. And unfortunately, we're hard-pressed to do that. We are the land of steady habits, not only in the legislature, but certainly on the municipal level. But we had 4 ways that you could solve a budget problem. You could increase taxes, and God knows I don't think we could afford to do that any longer coming off the largest tax increase ever. You could borrow money. We can't afford to do that either. Our bond rating has already dropped because we borrowed too much money. You could look to your state employees, and at least for the next 2 years, that cannot happen because of the deal the governor cut with the state employees. So really, it ends up with regard to spending less, spending no more than you take in. Ironically, it sounds so simplistic, but if we spent not a nickel more than we did just in this fiscal year, next year, we'd be in surplus and not in deficit. So, and a lot of people say, boy, that's easy. If I'm going to watch my pennies and budget for my household, I'm just not going to spend what at least more than what I just spent last year. We don't do that in government. It's a simple solution, but it's a difficult way to get there. And I think Brendan's absolutely right. We have to prioritize. What is it in the state of Connecticut that is most important to us? Obviously, taking care of those who can't take care of themselves, education, transportation. But some of those other things we've done historically, I think we're going to have to look.
To the tune of $2.1 or $2.2 billion. When we come back, let's talk about where those cuts are going to really come. You've been on this program many times. We always talk about the DMV. As soon as we want to close one of those DMV offices, everyone says, "Oh no, wait a minute, this is a bad idea." We'll talk about it in just a second. Stay with us. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby, talking about the future of Connecticut. This is a budget session for the legislature in which they set the budget for 2 years, and they face some serious issues. Let me reintroduce our guests. House Republican leader Larry Cafero is a Republican from Norwalk, and House Speaker Brendan Sharkey, a Democrat from Hamden. Education is the biggest expenditure for local communities. It was the primary focus of the last legislative session. When you talk about, well, if we just hold the line and not increase whatever it is, 3% in the coming year, we'd be fine. Can you see local communities cutting in education at this point? It's going to have to be an increase in the mill rate.
Well, I think there's various things we could do. First of all, before we get to saying to the municipalities, we're taking this away from you or that away from you, we have to look at our own house and see what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And we just went through this exercise, obviously on a smaller scale, but we had on the table over probably $500 million worth of options out there. They were all tough options to make. But we were able to get through it in a bipartisan way. That's the kind of thing we're going to have to do in the next year for the 2-year budget, Tom. It's going to be tough. We're going to have those stakeholders at the table. What can we do cheaper without decimating the service that we provide? Tough question, but it's something that has to happen. We have to do it.
Can you paint us a picture of what that's going to mean?
Well, I think as you know, I've been a long time proponent for efficiencies at the local level. I've been kind of the guy who's been pushing the agenda of regionalizing services as much as possible, while also maintaining local control over the things that really matter.
Which is always a point of contention in Connecticut,
of course it
which
is.
Doesn't have regional government.
Of course it is. And I think on the education side, to your question earlier, there is a tremendous amount of inefficiency that occurs by having 150 some odd, there are 169 towns, but there's 150 some odd school districts around the state, all of which have superintendents and assistant superintendents. And in some towns, they actually have multiple school districts with multiple superintendents, all making 6-figure salaries. We have to start looking at ways in which we can maintain the integrity of the local school system, but also create the efficiencies that are inherent in how the world is working today. I mean, I don't think anybody who has a job and is working anywhere has not experienced the kinds of cost cutting and efficiencies in their
But
own
you also
lives.
experienced the outcry in the last session when this was talked about.
Sure, and so therefore what we have to do is engage in a discussion with our local boards of education and our municipalities on how we will mitigate the impact of a potential cut. And I think I've pledged to a lot of the municipal groups and boards of ed groups around the state that I want to reinstate a program that we did a few years ago called the Moore Commission that I chaired, where we had that dialogue with towns and cities about ideas that will create the efficiencies that they need to lower property taxes. In this case, the incentive is if there's a cut coming and you don't want to be raising local property taxes, then let's work together on what the state can do to facilitate efficiencies at the local level. And as Larry said, it's about changing, I think, some of the steady habits that we've had, recognizing that we really just can't afford to have a lot of the systems in place that we do right now.
Can you see this in our region? I can see the folks now in New Canaan and Darien and Westport, Wilton, putting up a wall like they have, but
in
there's
Israel.
We're not going to have regional anything. We are happy with the way things are.
Well, I'll give you one example. It's not necessarily regional, but as Brendan said, where technology could really help. Right now we have all of our police departments, our fire departments, et cetera, that train their individuals at a central location, whether that's all coming to Stamford or all coming to Hamden or wherever, whatever part of the state. And it is a rather old-fashioned way of training, if you will. It's been around forever. It's called the Sage on the Stage, where somebody teaches a classroom of people. You have to let those people off their jobs locally, put them up for a couple of days for this training. Technology is advanced such that you actually could have kiosks and interactive training tools right in your local police department or fire department, et cetera. To have that kind of equipment, if you will, available at a local level saves the local municipalities a lot of money. It's a very different way of doing things, but it still accomplishes the result. In fact, I would argue even in a better manner than currently, and it does so at less cost. Will it be tough for some people to get used to? I'm sure it will, but I think it's a necessity of the time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the folks at the local level understand that. I mean, I think the local property taxpayers understand that efficiency is really the way we need to go. But to your point about a lot of the Fairfield County towns, I'm a Fairfield boy. I grew up in Fairfield, and I'm a product of Fairfield Public Schools through grade school, and I know how difficult that is in parts of the state. But I also think that...
Yeah, let's not just pick up Fairfield County.
No, sure.
I'm sure the folks up in West Hartford aren't going to be happy with this either.
That's right. And I don't think that we're talking about a massive takeover of our school systems. We're just talking about the common sense kind of efficiencies that will save everybody money, but just that folks are reticent to get involved in right now because it's just not the way they do things. I think the incentive that they're going to have, whereas before it was voluntary, we tried to create financial incentives to move in this direction. I think now the incentive is what may be coming down the road in terms of the state budget.
Got to worry about our budget. We'll take one last break. Back in just a moment. Stay with us. Just a few minutes left with our guests. Let me jump to another topic which I don't think anyone expected to be high on the list, and unfortunately, you mentioned the Newtown shootings. Gun control has moved to certainly to the level of the budget. Will we see major action in this session on this?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. We're working on a bipartisan basis to put together a package of legislation that we think we can hopefully get done before the end of February. That's kind of the common sense stuff that we should be doing short term, but also with an eye towards the longer term as well. We really need to not just be focusing on gun safety, but also all the other aspects: education, school safety, mental health services for sure, video games, and how our society treats violence in general. All of those things are kind of short. There's short and long-term goals that we're trying to achieve, but I think we're all committed to working very quickly to try to address some of the short-term things while we also then look to the long-term as well.
And you mentioned mental health. There's another area that's going to be awfully hard to cut, given the needs and given this issue now in Sandy Hook.
Right, but I've been around long enough to know that cutting the amount of money one spends on a program doesn't necessarily mean doesn't have to mean cutting the quality and amount of service that you give. If you, as we talked about, there's different ways to deliver the same service, and many times it could be done with less money. And that's, of course, the challenge that we face, because mental health has to be high on that list. It was certainly part of the whole mix of the tragedy that happened in Newtown. The other thing is what we've learned, I think Brendan and I, and to Brendan's credit, the very first day, it was hours after he was sworn in, just a couple of hours, that he convened a bipartisan meeting to talk about how we process through the kind of decisions we're going to have to make in the wake of Newtown, with the goal of, as Brendan indicated, coming up with some common sense legislation by the end of February, and also towards an eye of more legislation down the road. And what we both learned, both of us had the opportunity to sit in on a demonstration at the Department of Public Safety. We called it Guns 101. There's so much that many of us don't know about guns. The media doesn't know about guns. The public doesn't know about guns. And we have talked about first educating certainly our caucus and the public as we go forward with this legislation. I think it'll be very, very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. It was an eye-opening experience that Larry and I participated in just before session began, and yeah, it's issues that there are certain things that we should do that I think the public expects us to do. Not all of those things, though, will be as effective as others, and we really do need to have an intelligent approach to this, getting input from all sides, gun advocates as well as gun safety advocates. So that we come up with the right balance that addresses the problem as opposed to making folks feel good about things. So we really need to do some of those symbolic things, absolutely, but we also have to do some of the long-term, harder policy issues.
Got just a couple of minutes left. An issue that certainly doesn't belong at the top of the list, but for folks down here will be, and that's the discussion about possibly putting tolls back on the highways. And there's going to be a committee that looks at this. But certainly you've been here and you were here when we had tolls. This is not something that southwestern Connecticut or the other end of the state wants to see. Can we do this and not lose federal dollars? That's not going to be the issue, but that's certainly one of the ones that's kept the tolls off the road.
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, we can do it without losing federal dollars. That's a bit of a misperception that's out there, which I understand. I remember the crash in Stratford that led to the abolition of tolls. But I think that we have to look at revenue streams of some kind to help cover the costs of our infrastructure. I mean, we also pay the highest gas prices in most of the Northeast, and
particularly down here.
Right, and the reason is that we don't have tolls. I mean, the central reason for that is that we don't have tolls, whereas other states have tolls, and we're subsidizing their gas prices as they drive through our state. We are losing that revenue, and we have to make it up through our gas tax, and that's, I think, something that a lot of folks in the state are also concerned about. We have to find the right balance. Again, it's not. There's not one answer.
Am I right that next time you're at a constituent event, that this is going to be one of the things that people grab you by the lapels?
People have already started, and I don't think anyone, I'll speak for myself, wants to go back to 1983. That's the last time we had tolls in the state of Connecticut, and they were those tolls with the toll keepers and the lines backed up and the fumes, with idling cars, et cetera. It was a nightmare. No one wants to go back to that. But since 1983 to today, the technology again has changed. I think everyone has easy passes, et cetera. So we have to see how we could best accomplish that without going backwards in time to 1983. One of the unique things we have on our thruway, for instance, that's different than the Pennsylvania Turnpike or the New Jersey Turnpike, is we have exits every 2 seconds. That's something we're going to have to handle.
I thank you both for joining us. We've run out of time, but I think bipartisanship at least lived on this panel, and
absolutely
hope it can continue.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
for joining us as well. Please stay tuned. The news continues.